I'm standing between the graves of Colonel John Addison Cobb, who gave his name to that village west of Athens named Cobham, and we do stress the ham on that, it's not Cobham, and his wife, Sarah Robinson Roots Cobb. And they died 10 years apart, 1855, a year before this cemetery for the father, and 1865 for the mother. We have a letter written by their son, Thomas R. Cobb, who was named for the mother's father, Thomas Reed Roots, a Virginian, in which he wrote it in the fall of 1858, and he said, "As I write, the fences are going up on the lots at Oconee Hill." So this fence surrounding this lot went up in the fall of 1858, and the fence on the adjoining lot, the Lumpkin Cobb lot, went up at the same time. These fences were made by Wood and Perot in Philadelphia. And as you see on Mrs. Cobb's marker, it was made in Atlanta, the year of her death. This one was made in New York at the same time that the column was made for the Lumpkin Cobb lot. Tom wrote that the monuments are being made as I write. So we know that the one for his father would have been buried somewhere else temporarily and then moved in. A number of the graves on this lot were moved in. The Cobb's daughter, Laura, is buried over here. She was married to Williams Rutherford, and she is the lady who wrote the letter to the Athens newspaper saying, "We have to educate our daughters away from home while we can educate our sons here in Athens. Why don't we have a school for women in Athens?" That letter caught the attention of her brother, Thomas R. Cobb, who only had daughters, and he was one of the principal fundraisers for a women's school in Athens, which was to have been known as the Athens Female Academy. But his daughter Lucy died during the fundraising, and it was suggested by the largest givers that they named the school Lucy Cobb Institute. So that's how that school got its name. This is the marker for Laura Cobb Rutherford, daughter of Colonel John Addison Cobb and his wife. And Laura was a very intelligent woman and a leader in many, many undertakings in Athens. The Cobbs just had great ability and great leadership qualities. And Laura wrote an anonymous letter to the Athens newspapers in the early 1850s that said she just didn't understand, it was signed a mother, why we could educate our sons right here in Athens at a university, but we had to send our daughters away from town to get further education from them. Well, this letter really snared the attention of her brother, Tom Cobb, who only had daughters. He did not know his sister wrote the letter, but he became one of the major fundraisers for a school for women. It was to be known as the Athens Female Institute, but during the course of the fundraising, Tom's oldest daughter, Lucy, died. And so some of the other major contributors to the fund came to him and said, "Would you be agreeable to our naming the school Lucy Cobb Institute?" And that is how the school got its name, for his daughter. But these are lovely monuments of another style than what we've been looking at. And her husband, Williams Rutherford, was the son of a graduate of the first class of graduates of the university. His father's name was also Williams Rutherford, and they were of a Middle Georgia family, owned extensive plantations in Middle Georgia. And when Williams married Laura, they went to live in Middle Georgia. But Laura's father, John Addison Cobb, signed a lot of promissory notes for his friends, and when the Panic of 1837 came along, it had a horrible financial effect on him and caused him to lose all of his property. So I think Laura talked her husband into coming up here to save her father. And he bought a plantation that her father had owned over in Walton County, and they lived over there for a number of years before they swapped houses with Junius Hillier and moved to Athens. And Williams eventually became a mathematics professor at the University of Georgia. I think he's the best son-in-law I've ever heard of, and he really took care of his wife's family. And this is another example of what Milton told me years ago, and these are not this couple, but the Cobbs, or Milton's ancestors, that if an Athens girl marries a boy from somewhere else, sooner or later he's going to wind up in Athens. And Williams Rutherford certainly did. This obelisk commemorates the lives of Colonel William Henry Jackson and his wife, Mildred Cobb Jackson. Mildred was the sister of Colonel John Addison Cobb, and Colonel Jackson was the son of Georgia Governor James Jackson, a revolutionary governor of Georgia. Colonel Jackson was on the faculty of the University of Georgia, and he was also an amanuensis to Governor Lumpkin when Governor Lumpkin was writing his biography. At one time, the Jacksons lived across the street from a very handsome tree, which according to local legend, and it is that, despite what a lot of people want to think, it is a legend, that he so loved that tree that he deeded the land it grew on to the tree. That is an illegal impossibility, but people like the story. So a sign was made and put under the tree that it owned itself. It was the tree that owned itself. And it eventually aged out and was struck by lightning, and a sign of that tree was growing beneath it, and so it was planted to take the place of the tree that owns itself, and that is the tree that grows at the end of Deering Street today. But this is the man who supposedly gave the tree to itself. The story comes from a newspaper man in Athens, Mr. Gant. And the story was created to save the tree when the streets in Athens were finally getting widened to regulation width. And had they widened the street to regulation width, they would have had to have cut down that tree. And it was a beautiful symmetrical tree, so it has been allowed to occupy the end of the street to the present day. The Jackson's daughter, Mary Athena Cobb, married Andrew Jackson Lamar, and we have done a video of his monument, which was moved here from Alabama many years after his death, 52 years after his death. And then Mary Athena married her cousin, John Boswell Cobb, who was a brother of Thomas R. Cobb and Howell Cobb. So she is buried in the lot with her aunt and uncle, who were also her in-laws. So the more you learn about Athens, the more the family ties get tighter and tighter and more tangled. This is the grave of Mildred Lewis Rutherford, daughter of Williams and Laura Cobb Rutherford. She was educated at Lucy Cobb, and then she is prominently identified with the administration of Lucy Cobb for the latter half of the 1800s and the early 1900s. At first, she and her sister, Mrs. Lipscomb, sort of swapped administrative duties, but it finally became Miss Miss Millie, as she was called. And Miss Millie was a totally unreconstructed rebel. She assembled as many Confederate things as she could. She had things that belonged to her brother, her Uncle Howell Cobb, her Uncle Tom Cobb. She had traveled widely in Europe, taking the girls of Lucy Cobb on tours. Her house, which was across the street from Lucy Cobb, was a virtual museum. And she was old and sick and a bed invalid, and her house caught on fire Christmas night. A passing motorist saw the flames shooting out of the house and stopped, and with the help of her nurse got Miss Millie out on a mattress, but they saved precious few of the wonderful documents and memorabilia that was inside. And she lived another year and died at the home of her sister, Mrs. Rutherford, Mrs. Rutherford's daughter.